Russian missiles hit a crowded shopping mall in Ukraine's second largest city.
The rescue operations, the operation to find bodies of people is still ongoing, and debris on the side of this shopping mall is really difficult to search because of the heavy fires.
Plus, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky secures a pledge of additional air defense missiles from Spain as NATO's chief urges other allies to step up.
Self-defense is enshrined in international law. So Ukraine has the right to defend themselves against Russian aggression. We have the right as NATO allies to help Ukraine uphold the right of self-defense.
And later in the program, the number of Ukrainians dealing with mental health issues has been on the rise since the start of the war. A coffee shop that just opened near the front lines is helping people cope. Today is Monday, May 27th. From the Voice of America, this is Flashpoint Ukraine. Good evening, I'm Lori London. Russian missiles struck a popular shopping mall filled with people in Kharkiv, Ukraine over the weekend. Anna Chernikova in Kyiv joined us for an update.
The city of Kharkiv is under really heavy shelling for the past months, and on Saturday it was yet another really heavy attack. Russian forces hit one of the shopping malls, a really popular chain within the Ukrainians, with 2 missiles. This shopping mall chain usually over the weekend collect a lot of people who come just to buy different kind of stuff. And on Saturday, it was also another busy day. At this point, just recently confirmed that at least 18 people were found dead as a result of this attack, and dozens are injured. Still, it's not clear the final numbers because the rescue operations, the operation to find bodies of people is still ongoing, and debris on the side of this shopping mall is really difficult to search because of the heavy fires that was on the site. But at this point, the emergency service of Ukraine confirmed that at least 45 people were injured as a result of the attack and 18 killed.
Was the whole mall completely destroyed?
Almost. The most part of the mall was destroyed. Everything was on fire. The footage, which is available from the security cameras, show that there were 2 hits. 2 missiles hit directly the shopping mall. And as I already mentioned, it's a very popular chain of the shopping mall within Ukraine. So across Ukraine, you can find this particular chain, and it is really popular with Ukrainians, and especially over the weekend, a lot of people come to purchase different kind of stuff.
And what's the latest on the front line, Anna? In the past few weeks, it's been pretty intense.
The most active actions on the front line are happening in the Kharkiv region and in the Donetsk region, so no change in here. In terms of the Kharkiv region, it is quite clear that Russian forces are trying to create a so-called gray zone or buffer zone on the territory of Ukraine, close to the border, in order to have a certain area where Russian forces can allocate for further actions. At this point, what intelligence, Russian forces did not manage to create this buffer zone along the whole territory of Kharkiv region, but President Zelensky said that it will be expected that a new assault will be happening, and that Russian Federation is planning the new assault on the Kharkiv region in order to reach this goal. But at this point, Russian forces managed to enter the territory of Ukraine at around 20 to 70 kilometers in different areas.
President Zelensky arrived in Madrid, Spain on Monday, meeting with the Prime Minister, looking to continue to get support to help Ukraine fight its more than 2-year war with Russia. What can you tell us about the visit? This
trip was postponed by President Zelensky. He was supposed to visit Madrid a bit earlier, but due to the Russian assault in the Kharkiv region, he postponed the trip. And on Monday, he arrived to Madrid. He was met personally by the King of Spain, and later he met with the head of the Spanish government to sign a military support agreement with Spain. This agreement is one of those that Ukraine is signing with different countries as a long-term support of Ukraine, mostly in the military sector, in the military and defense areas. And what we know about particularly this agreement with Spain, that it was signed for 1 billion euros of military aid in a period up to 2027, and also 5 billion euros Spain Spain will be providing to Ukraine through the European Peace Fund. So 1 billion direct aid and 5 additional billion of aid will be also allocated through the Peace Fund.
Anna Chernikova reporting for us from Kyiv. Thank you so much, as always, for the update.
Thank you, Laurie.
And during meetings in Bulgaria on Monday, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg also condemned Russia's attack on the Kharkiv shopping mall over the weekend.
Many civilians killed, many wounded, and it's yet another example of the brutality of this war and why this war has to end and why Russia has to stop attacking a sovereign, independent nation.
Stoltenberg said that members of NATO had not delivered what was promised in military support to Ukraine and noted his hope that allies will individually reconsider limits that they've placed on their military assistance.
Some allies have lifted restrictions, other allies have not. My message is that I think we should now consider those restrictions, because by having too many restrictions, we are tying one hand of the Ukrainian armed forces on their back because they're reducing their capability to defend themselves.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says Russia launches about 3,000 bombs against Ukraine every month. On Friday, the Biden administration announced an additional $275 million in military aid to help repel relentless Russian assaults in the Kharkiv region. More from Associated Press correspondent Sagar Magani.
The package includes rocket systems, munitions, and artillery rounds. The State Department says Secretary of State Antony Blinken will also travel to Eastern Europe amid concerns about not just Russian advances in Ukraine, but its potential interference in neighboring Moldova and pro-Moscow legislation being pushed in Georgia. Sagar Magani, Washington.
Zelensky says Ukraine still urgently needs another 7 U.S.-made Patriot air defense systems to stop Russia from hitting the power grid and civilian areas, as well as military targets with devastating glide bombs that wreak widespread destruction. President Zelensky, in a video message Sunday, appealed to U.S. President Joe Biden and Chinese leader Xi Jinping to join in an upcoming peace summit. Russia also loomed large in neighboring Georgia on Sunday as it held celebrations marking its Independence Day. My colleague Scott Walterman spoke with Bronislav Slonchov, professor of political science from the University of California, San Diego.
You know, it's Independence Day, and yet the president is talking about the Russian threat, and people are in the streets protesting this new law, which they call the Russian law.
The reason they're calling it the Russian law is because it's patterned after a law that Putin had passed in Russia many years ago that they then used to clamp down basically on the freedom of press. And so they see this as the first step toward kind of curtailing their freedoms. And so that's part of the reason that people are so vehement about it. Like, on its surface, it doesn't sound like a big deal, like wanting NGOs to register their income, where they come from. We ask the NGOs here to register about things like this. But the problem is that people can see very clearly what's going to happen next, right? And so the Georgians are very afraid that they're having kind of a Ukrainian scenario, which is a creeping introduction of more and more influence in the Kremlin. So even though the president is very pro-Western, she's not really, powerful under the Georgian constitution. It's a parliamentary republic. And so it's the party in the prime minister. And these are known to be very pro-Russian. And so they're doing this. They already used force to suppress some of the demonstrations. They're, I think, very careful not to go as far as the pro-Russian government did in Ukraine, that eventually provoked widespread resistance with Maidan, right, and led to the fall of the government. So they're a little bit more careful. But it seems to be a similar scenario that's playing out. And the Georgians are very afraid because of their troubled history with Russia. Obviously, they declared independence, but there is Abkhazia and South Ossetia that are kind of an open wound still. And they did fight a war with the Russians, too.
And so, it's the same thing that basically Zelensky is saying in this video. He's characterizing the Russian aggression and pointing out that, the entire region is threatened, and then subsequently the rest of Europe as well.
So, this is the way that's one of the big things that people disagree on, right? It's to what extent does threatening Ukraine, Georgia, or even the Baltic republics, certainly Moldova, because of Transnistria, So to what extent does this imply any designs on the rest of Europe? And I think there's a bit of a kind of misunderstanding. People talk about, if Ukraine falls, he's certainly going to invade further. That's not at all clear, because he doesn't need to be invading anything in order to get a lot more influence in Europe again. So there's, I think, two scenarios, right, with Ukraine. The problem is, if most of Ukraine is conquered, first of all, it's going to be seen portrayed as a outright defeat for the West, because we're seen as having invested heavily in helping Ukraine. And although here people would say, as long as some part of Ukraine remains independent, it's victory for Ukraine, that's not how it's going to play out, right? The Russians, the Chinese, everybody else will see it as basically Russia standing on its own against the combined forces of the West and prevailing in tearing a significant chunk of territory from Ukraine. And then it's anybody's guess what happens next, frankly, because in this scenario, that Russia will be emboldened at the very least. They will not probably attack immediately. They will anything, because they will need years to reconstruct from the mess they created. I mean, they're in terrible shape, actually, economically and militarily. So they're in no condition to go and attack Poland or, challenge NATO or anything like this. But what's going to happen is they will strengthen their relationship with China. With the war over, the Chinese don't have to worry too much about, running afoul of sanctions and things like this, which means the U.S. will concentrate more and more in the Pacific. And then it's completely up to the Europeans to decide what to do. And I'm quite afraid, frankly, that many Europeans would kind of long to go back to the good old days where they kind of seek some sort of accommodation with Russia instead of participating in what would be Cold War 2.0.
Do you think it emboldens China if the scenarios you laid out plays out?
Yes. One thing I kind of seems to be the case is that they don't want Russia to fail. Then I'm not sure they actually want Russia to win a whole lot either. They seem to enjoy kind of this Russia being in a subordinate position and kind of draining the resources and distracting the West, while China is, trying to establish more and more influence over Taiwan.
It's an interesting point about it puts China in a better position with Russia, for sure.
Yeah, yes. And you get to enjoy. See, the problem with war is that it very quickly begins to erode a lot of these benefits that you have, right? Kind of being a great power is being able to fight a war another great power, but actually fighting a war another great power usually is a very bad idea and ends pretty badly for everybody involved. And so the best thing from a Chinese perspective is, yes, for their relationship with Russia to strengthen, for the West to be drained. From this, the Western commitment to Taiwan to seem to weaken, and over time they can get probably peacefully what they're after. The more you can do it peacefully, the less reason there is to invade. Part of the reason that Putin went after Ukraine militarily is because he realized that he has no more levers to get peacefully what he wanted.
That was Bronislav Slonchev, professor of political science from the University of California, San Diego, speaking with my colleague, Scott Walterman. Meanwhile, some progress has been made by G7 officials on another way of securing additional funding for Ukraine. Associated Press correspondent Rika Ann Garcia has details.
Finance officials from the Group of Seven Rich Democracies, or G7, say that they've moved towards an agreement on a U.S. proposal to squeeze more money for Ukraine from Russian assets frozen in their countries. The proposal pushes to borrow against future interest income on the frozen assets to give Ukraine a large chunk of cash immediately. But the proposal has run into concerns from European members about the legal complexities and the possibility of Russia retaliating against Western companies and individuals who still have holdings in Russia. Despite the progress made, a final decision will rest with the G7 national leaders, including U.S. President Joe Biden at the annual summit in southern Italy. I'm Rika Ann Garcia.
You're listening to VOA's Flashpoint Ukraine. I'm Lori London. Experts say there's been a heavy increase in cases of Ukrainians suffering from anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress, and other mental health problems resulting from the war, which will likely have long-term impacts. For VOA, Lesia Bakalets reports.
This is the third spring when psychologist Polina Shadrina and her daughter Sofia spent in Warsaw instead of their native Kyiv. Shadrina, a refugee, helps her daughter with homework.
Де початок, де кінець?
Looking at an assignment, she asks the child where the beginning of the task is and where the end is.
Ти впевнена, що це початок?
They lived in Kyiv when Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The daughter has autism spectrum disorder, and after a month, Sofia's mental health got worse. So Shadrina says they fled to Warsaw.
Вона схоплювалася.
Shadrina recalls that her daughter reacted strongly to each air siren, even at night. Then she began to wake up at the slightest noise and had trouble falling asleep. And then she refused to go outside at all. A child psychologist herself, Shadrina says many children who stayed in Ukraine and many who fled are suffering from mental health issues.
Є діти, які не помічають.
Shadrina says some children adapt faster, but there are those whose anxiety has increased to such an extent that it affects sleep and appetite. She says that on top of it, there are adults around the children who are also tense. Another psychologist, Katerina Timakina, works for Veteran Hub, an NGO network that supports veterans and their relatives.
На 48% виросли тривожні розлади.
Timakina says this amount of stress is not something people could have been prepared for. She says anxiety disorders increased by 48% and depressive episodes, while adjustment disorders increased 46%. Counseling and therapy centers like this one called Open Doors also confirm a jump in the number of appeals for help.
Збільшилась кількість звернень.
Katerina Krylova, the director of Open Doors, says both military and civilian appeals increased by 80%. She says the center currently has 30 specialists working, and every week they receive about 30 new applications. Others suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. The Ukrainian Ministry of Health reports that in 2023, that number of patients with PTSD quadrupled since 2021.
Ознаками, коли ми можемо говорити про ПТСР, це
Yulia Tokolenko, psychologist of Center Open Doors, says that among PTSD symptoms may be insomnia, aggression, and flashbacks, when a person seems to return to the moment of trauma and doesn't understand what is happening around him. Katerina Timakina says it will take time to know the real scale of the war's impact on mental health, because Ukrainian civilians and military personnel are still experiencing the trauma.
реально ми будемо розуміти, що відбувається.
Timakina says people will fully understand the mental impact on Ukrainians as society only when the hostilities are over. Separately talking about people in the military, she says their mental health state can be evaluated 6 months to a year after the first wave of demobilization. The World Health Organization says 1 in 5 people living in conflict areas around the world has some form of mental health condition. Applying the UN estimate to the Ukrainian population in 2024 means about 8.5 million people are likely affected. Lesia Bakalets, VOA News, Kyiv.
And in the city of Kupiansk in eastern Ukraine, a small coffee shop sits just 8 kilometers away from the front lines. It opened last summer, the latest in a chain of coffee shops in the region. Despite the ongoing war, its owner says more are on the way. Anna Kustachenko met with the businessman.
This cafe in Kupiansk, Ukraine, just 8 kilometers from the front line, opened in July. The man behind it is Dmitro Kabanets of Kharkiv. He already has a chain of coffee shops in Kharkiv that he started in 2019.
I had an idea to open a coffee shop in the liberated territory since 2022. It was a chance not only to celebrate the culture of coffee making, but also to create a place where locals can rest, to create job opportunities and to cheer people up.
Local resident Alina, who did not want to share her last name for safety reasons, has worked at the Kupiansk coffee shop from day one. Her daughter Sofia also helps. Sofia was injured in winter when Russian forces fired on the city.
There was shelling near our house. I got a contusion.
Kabanet says money raised in the coffee shop is sent to the Kharkiv region for humanitarian needs.
In August, we bought stationery for local school kids. Even though classes are held online, they still need supplies. Our profits were small, about $250, and we spent it all on kids.
Kabanets owns other coffee shops in the city of Kharkiv, about 30 kilometers from the Russian-Ukrainian border. He says the city is constantly under shelling. Despite the danger, Dutch photojournalist Count van Etten came to Kharkiv to work, and thanks to some friends' recommendations, he found Kabanet's coffee shop.
The coffee is really good, but I think the magic of the coffee is also the people who are making it. People are living here as well, and I wanted to capture the story of the people who are still living here, and also to know why they choose to stay, and that's why I've come to Kharkiv.
For some, having a chance to make a cup of coffee provides a sense of normalcy. Andriy, a soldier who did not share his last name for security reasons, once worked as a barista.
To me, it's a moment of relaxation, a kind of meditation, an opportunity to forget about the war for just a bit.
Kabanet says he has no plans to leave despite Russian forces' advances on Kharkiv. What's more, he says he plans to open yet another coffee shop in Izum, some 50 kilometers from the front line. Izum was occupied by Russian forces for 6 months in 2022. Anna Kostyuchenko for VOA News, Kharkiv region, Ukraine.
May 20th marked Volodymyr Zelensky's 5th anniversary as Ukraine's president. Under Ukrainian law, the president serves 5 years, but elections have been postponed while the country remains under martial law. Katerina Besedina examines Zelensky's challenging term so far. Anna Rice narrates her story.
This is a new face.
5 years ago in May, a new politician, but a familiar face to Ukrainians, became the country's president. 41-year-old actor, comedian, and businessman Volodymyr Zelensky was inaugurated as Ukraine's 6th president. Volodymyr Fisenko is from the Center for Political Studies in Kiev. He says Zelensky's presidency is one of a kind.
Ukraine is a country of political paradoxes galore, and Zelensky's presidency is one of the most striking of them. Politics was to him an object of sarcasm, of sharp satire, and suddenly he found himself in the place of those he criticized and mocked.
John Teft was the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine from 2009 to 2013.
In America, people were just amazed that this actor could not only win, but win by 73% of the vote. It was just amazing. But he didn't have a lot of experience, and I think in the early days you could see it took him some time to put together a team. It took some time for him to gain the experience he needed.
Among Zelensky's promises as president, to fight corruption and poverty, and to persuade Russian President Vladimir Putin to return Crimea and Donbass to Ukraine.
If I meet with Mr. Putin, I'll say to him, finally, you returned our territories. How much more money are you willing to keep giving us to compensate for the fact that you took our territories away?
Fisenko says before Russia invaded, Zelensky thought he could negotiate with Putin peacefully.
He thought he'd start negotiations with Putin, look him in the eyes, convince him that he wants peace and that Putin also wants peace. He tried to do that, but it didn't work. Turns out Zelensky wants peace, but Putin doesn't. Putin wants Ukraine to submit.
On February 24th, 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. Many, including Western experts, believed Zelensky would flee, but he stayed and led. Fisenko says the war has changed Zelensky as much as it has changed Ukraine.
Zelensky became a wartime leader. He changed, physically and psychologically. He almost stopped smiling. He looks more mature, tougher.
In 2022, both Time magazine and the Financial Times named Zelensky Person of the Year. He has made multiple trips to the front line, including Bakhmut and Avdiivka, as well as to the liberated towns of Bucha, Izum, and Kherson. He has spoken to the U.S. Congress twice and has met with U.S. President Joe Biden numerous times. John Hardy is with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies.
Overall, I think he's shown really strong leadership. Without that leadership, I don't know where Ukraine might be today.
Zelensky says he will remain president while Ukraine is under martial law. For Katerina Besedina in Washington, Anna Rice, VOA News.
And that does it for our show today. Stay up to date with continuing coverage on Ukraine and news from around the world 24 hours a day at voanews.com. On behalf of everyone here at VOA, thank you for listening. Until next time, I'm Lori London.